Now, the story that I'm going to tell you is a true story. This takes place in Dublin, Ireland, in the year 1901. Now, in 1901, on the outskirts of Dublin, Ireland, there was a house. And this house in 1901 had not been lived in for a period of over 30 years. The reason being is because it had the reputation of being haunted. No one had lived in this house for that time. But in 1901, a young couple by the name of John and Mary Smith traveled to Dublin. They had just come from their honeymoon, and John was scheduled to start a new job. They needed a place to live. But at that time, the only place that was available for purchase or rent was a house that was called Phoenix Park. And this was the house that had the reputation of being haunted. Now, John, he took a tour of the house, and you have to remember, this was back in the days before electricity, so the only way that he could look at this house was by candlelight. So he took a tour through. He couldn't see anything wrong with the house, other than the fact that it was dusty and dingy and hadn't been lived in for a while. But other than that, it seemed to be in great condition. He was afraid that the house might be too expensive, but he was amazed at how economical the house was. And thinking that he had found a bargain, he purchased the house that was known as Phoenix Park. Now, the next day, John went to start his new job, and Mary, his wife, came to start cleaning up the house and getting it ready. Now, I'm going to have to explain the background of this house and how it's laid out. There was only one entrance into the house, which came into a kitchen dining room. From there, it came into a living room or parlor. And in the living room parlor was a stairwell that led to the guest rooms and the bedrooms upstairs. The only way that you could enter into this house was the one door through the kitchen. And in the living room, there was no doors or windows, making it completely impossible for any type of natural light to enter into the room. The only way that this room could be lit was either by a fire in the fireplace or by candlelight. Well, Mary, she brought 2 candles. She placed them on the hearth of the fireplace, and she started to clean. Now, she had been cleaning for a little while, and all of a sudden she noticed that the room was filled with an aura of blue light. Her first reaction was that this was sunshine, but then she remembered there was no windows or doors for sunshine to come in. She thought it must be the fire, but there was no fire burning. She thought maybe one of the candles had tipped over, but the candles were fine. And then she realized the house, the light, was not coming from in the room, but was coming from upstairs. So with her eyes, she followed the direction of the light. And there, at the top of the stairwell, leaning against the banister, was a young woman dressed in blue, surrounded completely by an aura of blue light. Now, at first, she thought that maybe this was a neighbor that didn't realize that the house had been purchased. So she called out to her. And as she did, the woman in blue turned around. She took one look at Mary, and Mary could see that there were tears in her eyes. But as soon as she saw Mary, she vanished completely. Now, needless to say, Mary was quite upset. And when John came home, she told him what had happened. Now, John was convinced that this was some type of joke or hoax. And so once again, they made a tour of the house so that he could find what was going on. But the only thing that he found that was different from his original tour was a small piece of wood on the mantel of the fireplace. And on this piece of wood were written in red letters the word Banshee, which is the Irish word for ghost. And upon closer examination, John realized that these letters were not in ink or paint, but blood. Well, John was determined to get to the bottom of this, so the next day he went to his job and he explained to his employers what was going on and that he needed some time off until he could get this resolved. He was afraid that because he was a new employee that his employers would not understand, but he found them to be very understanding. As a matter of fact, they told him to take all of the time that he needed. So he came back to the house where Mary was waiting for him. They decided to take 2 chairs and place it in the living room. and they decided to wait to see what would happen. And because Mary calling out to the woman in blue had frightened her away, this time they were determined to remain quiet to see what she would do. So they placed the 2 chairs there in the living room. They waited. At the exact same time as the day before, the mysterious blue light appeared in the room. And there, at the top of the stairs, leaning against the banister, was the woman in blue, dressed completely in blue, surrounded by the aura of blue light. They waited to see what she would do. And as they waited, suddenly another light appeared in the room, this time an orange light. And this light suddenly began to flicker, and in its midst appeared an older man, completely dressed in black. And he had a huge scar across one side of his face. He was so hideous to look at that Mary forgot her vow of silence. She gasped out in horror, and as she did so, the man in black turned and looked right at her. He took a long and bony finger and he pointed it straight at her. Then he pointed to the woman in blue. At this point, the woman in blue turned around, and just like before, there were tears in her eyes. And upon seeing John and Mary, she vanished. The old man took his long and bony finger and he pointed it at Mary once again. And then with a hideous shriek of laughter, he vanished as well. Now John was still convinced that this was some type of prank. Once again, they took a tour of the house, but they could find no evidence of a joke or a hoax of any kind. So they came back the next day. Same plan as before. They set the chairs in the same exact location. They waited to see what would happen. At the exact time as before, the mysterious blue light appeared in the room. At the top of the stairwell, leaning against the banister, there was the woman dressed completely in blue, surrounded by the aura of blue light. And as they waited a little bit more, the orange light once again appeared. And as it started to flicker, the old man dressed in black appeared as well. But this time, he didn't need some kind of a noise to make him aware that John and Mary was there. He knew. As soon as he appeared, he took his long and bony finger and he pointed it straight at Mary. Then he pointed to the woman in blue at the top. And at this point, the woman in blue turned around, and just like before, there were tears in her eyes, and she vanished. The old man took his long and bony finger and he pointed it once again at Mary, and then he pointed it at the fireplace. And with a hideous shriek of laughter, he vanished again. But as he vanished, a fire spontaneously combusted in the fireplace, and it was so hot that hot coals shot out onto the wooden floor. And because the house was so old and made entirely of wood, it was only a matter of seconds before the house was engulfed completely in flames. John and Mary had just enough time to escape with their lives. They went running outside. They turned to see that the entire house was ablaze, and they stood helplessly and watched as it burned to the ground. Now the fire drew a large crowd of people. And included in this crowd was an Irish policeman. And it was from this policeman that they learned the true history of the house that was known as Phoenix Park. You see, apparently 30 years earlier, this house was the meeting place of a notorious group of criminals that was called the Invincibles. Their leader was an older man, fond of wearing black, and known to have a huge scar across one side of his face. His younger wife, last seen wearing blue, was killed in a police raid along with him. The next morning, John and Mary returned to the house, which was now nothing but a smoldering pile of ashes. They started to look amongst the rubble to see if they could salvage anything. But the only thing that they were able to find was a small, thin piece of wood, written in blood, the word Banshee!